Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Gabriel and we'll be painting the high Seneschal. So before I start, I think you all know what's going on with the world at this day and age. So I've been kind of moved around a bit, so I still need to grab some things and it's a little bit of a mess, and I actually forgot to bring the model over so I can actually talk about it and hold it and show the paints with it. So um, I'll just have to go a little bit by ear this time, I suppose. So starting off, we're just laying down a base coat, and you can see how thin I'm applying all these layers. Really, it's you want to create texture by how you paint it and not by just slabbing it on and creating putting so much paint on that you're creating texture that way. um, and the problem is texture really doesn't work on miniatures of this scale just because of how enormous this texture would be if you actually scaled it up. So really we're going to have to do it by um, you know, actually painting texture, not saying, oh, well, it's not thick paint, it's texture. No, thin your paints. Make sure that your brush is loaded enough. That's one thing I learned recently. It's like it's better just to have the paint flowing off and always have more paint on the palette than you need, because if you're just trying to eke out that stuff, you're just hurting your model and you're just making it worse. And that's a simple fact there. You want to have plenty of paint, plenty of flow, plenty of coverage. Don't try and eke it out. Your paints, maybe you'll waste a few pennies over the life of your paint, but really you're going to get a lot more value than you think out of the little pots or bottles. And so here, I'm just layering on different shades of brown. So I have like kind of a more yellowish brown on the outside of the cloak and kind of his lower hanging cloak or shirt. And then I have warmer colors, and here I mixed in quite a bit of blue, so it's kind of like almost like a grayish tone on this upper part here. So really, it's like a series of browns, but I thought I don't want to have it monotone because that just looks incredibly dull, and I don't want to have it, um, you know, too too colorful. This is definitely not a cyan and violet and brilliant reds. It should still be muted, but you really don't have to bore your viewer and your opponents, whoever's looking at it, with, oh, it's just a dark brown, oh, it's a medium brown, oh, it's just a light brown. It's Browns can be a lot more interesting than that. So definitely play with the colors, and you really don't need that many. I just All of this was with a single base brown. I mixed in a little red, I mixed in a little blue, mixed in a little yellow in various amounts, and you just find colors you're happy with. And now here I'm using a desaturated green for the book. I thought it would be nice to have something that wasn't just a straight brown color. So I have my light German camo from Vallejo, and then I just mixed that in with some red and some black until it was darkened down enough, um, where I feel it would match with the scheme. Because if I had that brilliant pure green, it really wouldn't fit in. But kind of having this nice sort of um, kind of aged and uh, a little less vibrant green really works. And now we're putting the first paints on the book. And so you'll see as I go through here, I'm using like a very nice bright cream, but uh, I'll be going back and forth between darker and lighter browns and yellows to really give that book a lot of depth and age. And um, the the more you play with it, um, it can't really hurt. And then for the quill, um, I was thinking about maybe going like a bright peacock color or something, but I decided it would be nice to keep it just somewhat um, kind of muted as well. I feel like a peacock color is definitely for Peter Baelish's sort of style. I think that would be much more fitting than something for this old chap. And now I'm not really using a different color. I'm just layering the base coat to get a stronger tone. So it has better coverage. And you can see I'm also adding a slightly darker brown in between those gaps to start to differentiate the highlights and shadows. But here I'm just wet blending the shadows. This is really effective just to create a pretty rough um, transition from your uh, mid-tone to your darker tone. So when you're continuing to layer on to build that opacity, um, you can just toss in that darker tone because the darker tones uh, are give far more coverage than lighter ones for the most part. It's really not that difficult to just create very strong shadow colors. And so uh, what I really like about this model is how crisp and how clear those shadow and highlight areas are. And so all I had to do was just block in those areas of shadow by, um, just adding that darker color in. And here as well, I'm just adding in green. I think I made it a little darker just because I wanted to even make that green even deeper. And now here I'm adding a little more color into the um, quill, just like little brown in there, but it's still very gray brown. And I'm just tossing some highlights in randomly. You can see this brush is really not fine. I'm just kind of picking out those areas of highlight and shadow that I want. And we'll do much finer work later. Now for the skin, I'm just kind of base coating the hands and the face. This isn't really this is more just to find out where the um, the skin ends, and that just helps you kind of trace uh, just to kind of pick out where the other textures end. If you're a little confused about is this skin, is this hair, you can always just paint over it, and once you meddle with paints a little bit, the details start to pop out and it becomes a little clearer. Because when it's all just kind of this muted gray or whatever you uh, base coated it with, it's a little bit more difficult. But when you have something that can give you that that insight, then why not? It's just a thin coat. And then for the shoes, I'm just using a nice uh, dark brown color. It's like almost a black, and that just I'm just picking out the shoes there. They're really not a focus, so you don't have to spend a ton of time. Just be careful not to get the color everywhere. And then you can see here I'm picking out the shadows and highlights of the that lower section of cloak by introducing even darker browns. And on the back of the cloak, I'm blending in and darkening those shadow areas to kind of give it even more definition. And as you'll see later on, you don't have to have perfectly smooth transitions, but if you just make sure you have a good contrast and you have something that's relatively smooth, it doesn't have to be award winning. I didn't spend 20, 30, 40 hours on this model. I just worked on until I was very happy, and that's kind of where I left it. If you want to spend the additional time, you can, but really, a lot of us went on Kickstarter, so you know, you really want to get your models done. So just being happy with the model, I think, is good. And if you want to win an award, then take it to the next step, of course. And now here I'm picking out those areas of highlight. Uh, you'll see later that I'll pull the highlights back. This isn't all going to be maximum highlight area, but I just wanted to uh, build up that contrast, and then we'll kind of bring the shadows and the highlights back together with some more medium colors. I'm just kind of picking out where those highlight areas are going to be. So you can see this is really a rough sketch. This is definitely not the final part. And the same thing with that dark gray brown uh, color around his upper chest and upper back. I'm just picking out those highlight and shadow colors as well, and I'll just be blending those in and bumping the contrast in the future. But the point now is just to kind of get those highlight and shadow areas, and then just make sure you're happy with the placement, and then just smooth them out later. You can see here I'm just uh, building up that base coat for the skin. I wanted a paler color, and I'm just kind of filling that out just so it can, you know, be ready to work on later. Now I'm highlighting the that cloak area, so you could see I'm kind of going down and then across, depending on the texture there. Um, and then I'm bringing that shadow back in, and it's just kind of a back and forth, really, of building up shadow and then finishing it off with highlight. And I like to keep building up that highlight and build up that shadow, but I find that when I get to that maximum shadow, I still have more highlighting to do. So don't forget to keep bringing it up. And then you can see here I'm picking out the details in the various other portions. Some areas you really don't need to highlight, like especially under his hands, that those sections that kind of pull off to the side. Um, those really don't have like great places to highlight, so you can just kind of um, leave that area low contrast and just keep it kind of darker. Now for the book, I'm introducing a lot of brown into it, and at various stages you'll see me make it a lot more pale, then I'll make it a lot more brown, and so really going back and forth with thin layers just helps build up complexity as the layers of light and dark kind of um, uh, work together layer over layer to create that aged effect. And here I'm just roughly picking out the kind of darker areas, and um, it's good when you're kind of doing this rough wet blend thing to go too far with the lights and shadows, because essentially what you're doing is when they overlap, they kind of mix into that um, rough mid-tone, and that's kind of the effect you want to have. And here we're building up the highlights on that kind of overflap sort of a section on his upper. And as at this point, you can see how the shadows are defined on his the cloak hanging on his back, and that kind of tells you that um, it's kind of going the right way. And then here I'm just roughly chopping in some highlights, and I'll just go back and bring back the darker tones. As you can see, well, it's a little hard to see with the focus, but um, you kind of just take the highlight, pull it back to middle and darker tones, and you take the darker and middle tones, bring it back to highlight. Again, it's just that play. But in the end, you don't want a bunch of midtones. You want to have a lot of contrast. And as you can see here, I'm starting to work on the skin, and I'm building up the highlight areas on the knuckles, the fingers, and the upturned areas on his hand. And so the right hand with the quill is more exposed, so you want to highlight more than the one that's kind of shaded under the book. But of course, the head is the focal point, and you want to really bump that contrast up. As you can see, I'm getting the skin tone all over the hair and the spectacles. That really doesn't matter because I'll be finishing the skin off and then painting over the hair and spectacles. So. And here I'm just adding additional layers of brightness, and I find it's a little hard to describe how to get skin in a place where I'm happy with. Sometimes it really doesn't work and sometimes it does, but essentially I'm just starting off with a darker tone and just being very selective about where I highlight. And that's the essence of painting skin for me, is um, building up those colors. And then I went too bright with this, and so I'm adding a much darker tone and then blending that in so the highlights actually have something. Because if it's just a very ghostly looking hand, it's really not going to look natural, and it's going to be pretty ugly because there is no. If it's just a bunch of white, essentially, you're not getting that nice contrast uh, with those shadow areas, and that is what makes looking at something exciting. Because if everything is very bright or very dark, it's just so ugly to look at. Might as well just make it all base coats. Now at this portion, you can see that I have a much finer brush now. I found that having a very small brush makes paint easier to control because of how much little I actually put on it, but it allows me to really um, use that fine tip. And so I'm actually creating a really um, fine feather texture. And you can see there when I added the shadow, it was a little bit too heavy, but I just sharpened it up and took that excess paint off. And then you can see how I'm just making tiny slashes. And I'm just picking out all those little details of the texture there, of the spines of the feather. And so that is um, just made by that tiny movements of just slice, 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 and just making those tiny dashes. And here I'm just using very fine amount of paint just to um, start to further push those highlights and shadows. Um, because of how close this kind of grayish um, part of his outfit is to the head. And then here I'm just picking out the upper areas pretty roughly. Um, but I'm also making it very bright to kind of bring attention to the face there. And here I'm continuing to build the contrast and bringing up the maximum highlight tones. You really think you have enough, and then you want to add another layer of brightness and add another layer of brightness. And it might take you more times than you think, just because of how it always kind of recedes back into a darker color, but just continuously brightening it up and darkening it up will make it even better. You might think, oh, I'm happy with it now. Boost the contrast. I know I've repeated this so many times in this video, but I think that's why I was so happy when I was done with this model, because I kept building the contrast up, and I can still push it further, and I should still push it further. Now I'm just adding some quick uh, age to the book by just creating these slash marks. Um, it's okay if they're a little thick, because you can take that base tone and then just kind of push over those scratches and just clean it up and make them a lot finer, and it'll look really really good. Even if they're not incredibly noticeable, it just adds some more texture and interest in the book, because I felt it was a little plain. And of course, I highlighted the edges as well, because those also get a bit of wear and tear and also would catch more light. And then here I'm just kind of, um, it's not like, it's kind of speckling on paint. And in essence, this is just kind of creating an uneven texture and a layer of paint on the book, just to continue kind of with that back and forth, and making it paler and darker and just playing with it. And here I'm just adding a little gentle highlight to those areas, especially on that kind of lining there. I'm just kind of picking out areas, and it's fine just to add random marks if they don't stand out too much, just because it kind of continues to build that excitement of different aspects of the model. It's not just a flat surface; it has a little bit of activity going on, but it doesn't have to be so out of the ordinary. It can be very subtle, just because you can see that mark just below his hand there. It's very hard to actually pick out, but it just changes it up slightly from being a flat um, monotone space. And here I'm just building up the highlights, and then notice the direction my brush is going. When I have a very thin color and I'm building up the highlight, I'm pushing it towards the area I want brightest. So on the kind of near where his shoulders are, I'm pushing it from below to the top, below to the top. And that is what's kind of bringing that color and letting it kind of and it creates this gradient from where your brush starts to where it ends, and that's where it deposits the most paint. So if you want the highlight to be, um, if you just have like a vertical line and you want the highlight to be higher, you'd start from low and finish high, and that's where you'd build up the most paint. And the same thing with the shadows here, is I'm bringing it down I'm also doing a little bit of up and down as well, just to kind of um, create a bit of uh, blending. And you can see here that with the midtone especially, I'm kind of blending the two together. I go too far here, so you can see I'm bringing that shadow back down, and so that's why it's very nice to have a wet palette, because I have all these colors at my disposal, so I could say, oh, I went a little too far. Let me bring the mid-tone in. Let me bring the darker tone in, and that kind of marries it together quickly without having to painfully glaze many layers. You can just kind of mix them together as they're still wet. And here I'm adding another layer of color to the book, and I'm just focusing on the outside edges just to kind of give it that familiar pattern, and also just kind of dolloping it around as well, and then adding in that brighter color again. And here I'm going back to the quill, and I'm just adding in that very fine texture of highlights, and I'm just building it up over and over again. When you go too far with the highlights, you just add the shadows again. And because these layers are so thin, I'm not actually um, getting rid of the texture at all. And just to note, I'm jumping around the model. I was thinking about ordering it, and so I'd say, oh, this is how I did the book, this is how I did the cloak, and just keep separating the sections. I thought it was nice to actually show them all together this time in the order I painted it. You can see I'm jumping around the model because I want a certain area to dry, um, and I want to go on to something else. And it also keeps you more interested, because if you're just playing with the cloak for hours and hours, you'll probably not wait until it's dry and then mess with it. Then it gets mucked up, and then you're more frustrated. But when you're jumping around and just fixing all the different areas, and just doing a little bit of work there, doing a little bit of work there, for me, it helps me forget the frustration of like, oh shoot, I kept messing up that area in the quill, and I kept introducing too much highlight. You can kind of forget about that and just return to it later when it dries, and you can add that shadow in effectively. At this point, I'm painting in the hair, and you can see I'm using a very fine brush to very carefully block in that area of gray. Um, and then I'm painting the back of the head as well, and just sort of finding the area where the hair should be. I was a little uncertain where I should stop, but if you just look closely at the texture, you'll kind of find it. And the thing is, because his hair is so thin, um, you don't have to worry about really missing the area of hair that it um, exactly where his hair is, simply because he's it can be you can paint on hair. If you have someone bald, you could paint on a little bit of hair on their head, just because it'll be so thin that creating that texture of hair with just paint would work perfectly fine. If there's just like a few weird strands like Gollum or something, which is kind of nasty to think about, but it works. And I'm just picking out a rough highlight for the shoes. This is about as much work I'm doing on them, so you can see, they look all right, but you're really not going to be paying that much attention to them. So having perfectly blended and worked on shoes, people are going to maybe give a half second's notice to it. So kind of think about where you want to put that effort in. And here I'm using a very thin paint just to kind of bring all those colors together. And it's okay if you get it over the darkest shadows or highest highlights, because you can just, work back from there. And again, I'm adding another layer to the book, and again, I'm adding more paint to the feathers, and all these minor adjustments. I'm just bouncing around the miniature because you get that fresh look. And here, because he has a bald spot, I painted the hair first, and now I'm just adding in higher and higher highlights. And that's another advantage of the wet palette, because you think you're done with the skin, and then you realize, oh, he has a bald spot. You have to paint the hair. Well, you have all your skin colors mixed up, and so you can just, boop, 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 build that highlight up, and not have to, feel like, oh, should I skip the step because I already, finished the skin. No, paint where you have to paint. Don't hold yourself back. And now I'm just building up highlighting on the hair, because of how kind of white it is. You really want to start with like kind of a lighter gray, and you could see the black I added was pretty dark, but because of how much highlight I'm adding to it, you still get that difference in values of that very dark, very light, but it's not like he has salt and pepper. He's very much a gray and white-haired old fella without the but you don't lose that highlight. Well, I'm sorry, that contrast. Probably said that word about 100 times. And here we're just continuing to build that light and shadow, and you can see I'm blending it in here. And I'm also doing a lot of work on the glasses. That was kind of a mistake on my part, just because I needed to paint in the lenses, like the rims first, and then I should have done all this work, but oh well. But it's good practice. So if you feel like, oh shoot, I did this extra work, you spend more time painting. So that's not too bad of a thing, hopefully. And then I noticed that I wasn't happy with how light the spine of the book is, because what happens is when you have layers of very bright color that's very thin, it can sink into the shadows and the creases, which is not what you want. So you can so I went back and just added this kind of darker tone to make it look more natural, because you shouldn't have a very bright color, in the creases. And here I'm just wiggling in some letters. I really didn't feel like trying to actually like write anything on that scale. But just make sure you have a very fine point, and that you're just using a very light touch. And then you can see I'm just adding a little bit of squiggly wiggly here. Nothing very impressive. I was thinking about maybe trying to put like a large letter on the top left of the other page, but it didn't work out exactly. But it's not especially important if you're just trying to kind of create a little bit of that just like the impression of writing on the page. Then you really don't need to go in and try and mark out letters and words. Just creating that little bit of pattern for people to kind of say, oh yeah, there's writing in the book, how nice. And at this point I'm working in the glasses, and you can see how very careful and slow I am at adding the color, and I'm trying to be as stable as possible. So I have my bottle that is on firmly on the desk that I'm holding. Then I have my elbow on the desk. I have my hand pressed against the base. I'm just very, very carefully just touching in those those rims there. And now I'm just going back and kind of um, messing with it a bit because some of the black of the rim got in there. Um, I decided to kind of do like a refracted light sort of thing, so you wouldn't actually have the eyeballs and like well, the glasses wouldn't be clear, but it would be kind of like the reflecting light, so they're a little bit blown out. Um, you could call that strategic painting because I didn't want to do those details, or I just wanted to create a certain effect. So you can make up your mind on that. But always know that if you're not happy with something, just let it dry, stop messing with it, come back later and say, oh, you know what, it wasn't that bad, or oh, I just need to do a little work, and just uh, very carefully, you know, change something. Because if you just, shift something a little bit, it can create quite a significant effect. So maybe just brightening up that highlight area a little bit, or kind of just, adding a bit of a mid-tone and just marrying these two things together really makes it easy. So once I was happy with the cloak, I worked on the metal areas, and so I'm just using kind of a lighter gray to pick out all the different chains and kind of medallions and such. I could have gone for different bronze and gold and silver colors, but I decided to kind of go for a uniform thing just because um, that's kind of just what I wanted to go with. I didn't really think that um, I wanted to kind of add a bunch of variety. Also, he's not a maester, so it's not like he has a bunch of links of different materials. So I decided I'll just keep it kind of simple and just and that would make it much easier to work on since you'd have the same shadows and highlights. And so the this part's a little long just because I basically did all the metal just in one sitting. Uh, so essentially I went base coat, then I kind of etched in darker areas between the links, and then the top of the links I highlighted with a bright white or in bright grays, and I basically just built up that color until it was very bright and very dark, and you have a nice high contrast non-metallic metal. I just felt like until I get a metal I really love, um, which I hear Vallejo's metal is the best. So I'll try and get my hands on that if there isn't anything on it from the shipping place and whatnot. But um, I don't know exactly why I did a non-metallic metal, but I just thought it'd be kind of fun just have a play since I'm really not doing that much blending. But for those medallions and those like kind of small rectangular and circular areas, I just built up highlights, and then I just kind of um, pushed, smoothed it out by pushing in some medium, mid, and darker colors, and just kind of worked with it until I was happy with that kind of rough blend of light to dark. And what I wanted to do on the metal, especially on the chains, was to really build up those bright, really build up that brightness because I didn't want to make it um, just kind of gray and dull. I wanted it to actually have some kind of metallic looking finish. And so because it's not true metallic, it won't actually flash when you turn it. So I just want to have very bright highlights to give you the impression that it's actually reflecting very bright light. Also, I apologize for a lot of the metal being out of focus, but that's my bad. Also, I didn't really do much highlighting on the glasses, just because of how small the rims were. That trying to highlight it, I would have just blended it in with that kind of refracted light through the glass, um, and so it wouldn't have had much purpose to try and highlight it because it would have just kind of all um, kind of meshed together, and I wanted to keep the rims distinct, and so I decided I would just go with a matte material for the rims. For the base, I just did a pretty simple paint scheme. You can see I kind of have like a medium gray here, so I'm just blotting that in. Don't worry too much if it gets on the bottom of the cloak or anything. Just wipe it off while it's still wet. And if you happen to miss any when it's dried, you can always just go over with that base color. Because of how low the shoes and the bottom edge of the cloak are, it doesn't really they're really low priority when it comes to what the eye is going to be looking at, unless you make them much brighter and more interesting. So especially when I'm stippling on these kind of highlight colors, it really doesn't matter if you get a little bit on. You can always just clean it up later. And then I'm just building up brighter and brighter colors, and then just marrying it with just a brown wash at the end. And that's just to kind of give it that final kind of blend over. But you can see it's not it doesn't have to be especially fancy. Just creating a nice sort of texture and uh, a little bit of contrast in the bottom there. That will kind of be enough for you. And wherever I have a little bit too much shade on top of the cobbles, you can just take your brush and dry it. Well, that about wraps it up. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you for the next one. Stay healthy and keep painting.